Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. From page 69, Chapter 4, Babykins. The hills above Hollywood, 5 years earlier in the spring of 1921. Natasha Rambova gripped the steering wheel of her Buick Roadster as the car bounced along the rutted road. She scanned the shadows for potholes, while narrowly avoiding a few nocturnal creatures as they skittered toward the safety of the dark brush. The Buick rolled along, and Natasha made every effort to prevent her precariously perched passenger from flying off the back of the vehicle. Rudy straddled the Buick's lowered canvas roof, with one leg in the back seat and the other draped across the trunk. Across his lap he held a loaded Winchester hunting rifle. Decked out in a woolen jacket, a pair of +4 knickers, a beret, and a cartridge belt, he was fit to kill. He and Natasha were poaching quail and rabbit on the Robertson Coal Ranch in the Santa Ynez Canyon just north of Santa Monica. They often hunted in the canyon and always set their limit for each hunt at 8 birds and 4 rabbits. As Natasha maneuvered the Buick along the dirt road, Rudy prepared to bag his last bird of the night. He was a straight shot, and 7 unlucky birds had already been tossed in the back seat. With a final blast, another plump quail was headed for the garlic and olive oil. Having met their quota in quail, Natasha parked the roadster in the bushes so Rudy could track the rabbits on foot. With his rifle tucked under his arm, he set out to clear a path through the dry brush and quickly fired a few more shots. Before long, he bagged his 4 rabbits and headed back towards the Buick. By then, morning light threatened their cover of darkness, and it was time to hurry down through the canyon towards their little home on Sunset Boulevard. With the rifle and quarry hidden safely in the trunk, Rudy took the wheel of the Buick to speed towards Hollywood. Within a half a mile, he spotted a police officer standing in the road, motioning him to pull over. Rudy slammed on the brakes and pulled the Buick onto the road's gravel shoulder. The officer strolled over to the car and asked if either of them had heard any gunshots or seen anyone with a gun. With their kills still warm in the baggage compartment, both Rudy and Natasha sat frozen in their seats. The actor took his cue. "Why, yes, sir, we did," Rudy offered. "We did just pass a man with a rifle a way back." He looked to Natasha for acknowledgement of the fact, right? She feigned disinterest in the conversation and gave a half-hearted shrug. The officer bought their bluff, thanked them both, and Rudy hit the accelerator. For a moment the two poachers stared straight ahead, as if the Warren could still see their guilty faces. When Natasha felt it was safe to do so, she caught a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure the officer was indeed fading into the distance. "Rudy, this is the last time," she vowed. He reached to give her a playful pat. "What a performance, Babykins." The car swerved, Natasha screamed, and Rudy recovered the steering wheel just in the nick of time. From the moment Rudolph Valentino laid his infamous slow eyes on Natasha Rambova, his friends all knew she was always Rudy's girl. The two were introduced on the Metro Pictures studio lot, where she worked as an art director and he as an actor. Although Rudy never spent a single night in bed with his wife, Jean Acker, when he met Natasha, he was still a married man. In the eyes of the law and Jean Acker, he was not at liberty to be carrying on with anyone, let alone the talented and beautiful Natasha Rambova. Most formal photographs of Rudy and Natasha give the impression they were sedate, middle-aged, and erudite. However, first-hand accounts from their friends and family reveal the opposite, and portray them as openly passionate about each other and as fun-loving and thrill-seeking as any of their peers. Stylistically, Natasha Rambova could not be described as a flapper, as she wore her hair wound into a bun and preferred long dresses. But her outward appearance belied her free spirit, and both she and Rudy lived their private lives as avant-garde artists with little allegiance to any dogma or social convention. Consequently, his marital status at the time of their introduction did nothing to restrain either of them from engaging in a public love affair. Natasha, I want you to meet Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph, this is Miss Rambova, my art director. With these words, producer and actress Alla Nazimova presented her next candidate for the lead role in her production of Camille to the film's art director, Natasha Rambova. Natasha was surprised to see Rudolph Valentino standing at her office door and astonished he would consider auditioning for the role. It was common knowledge in the Hollywood community that Alla Nazimova once publicly accused Rudolph Valentino of being a home-wrecking Lothario. Nazimova lived in New York City during the DeSaule's divorce hearing, as well as Jack DeSaule's murder trial. During a dinner party at the Ship's Cafe in Santa Monica, she chided Rudy about his role in the DeSaule's scandals. In the presence of several Metro executives and actress Dagmar Godowsky, Nazimova referred to Rudy as a pimp and put the blame for Jack DeSaule's murder squarely upon his illicit affair with Mrs. DeSaule's. So when Natasha first shook Rudy's hand, she assumed he'd forgotten the incident at the Ship's Cafe. Natasha had just rejected several actors for Camille's lead male role, and her initial reaction to Rudy was much the same as it had been for every other candidate. He hardly looked the part. It did not help matters that Nazimova escorted Rudy to meet Natasha directly from the set of Uncharted Seas, where he had just completed a scene requiring a dousing with a studio-generated snowstorm of mica used as artificial snow. By the time Nazimova left Rudy alone with Natasha, the Los Angeles heat was not helping his faux Yukon appeal, and he was glistening with sweat, melting stage makeup, and white, shiny flecks. Natasha eyed Rudy for a few moments before asking if he would submit to a makeup test. He agreed, but asked if in return she might put in a good word for him with Madame Nazimova. If Rudy hadn't smiled with this request, Natasha might never have handed him the part. She would never be sure whether it was his straight white teeth or the flecks of white mica on his face, but she was dazzled. With a click of his heels and a slight bow, Rudy grinned and turned to leave. The role was his, and before long, so was the heart of the film's art director. It was not surprising that Rudy and Natasha were immediately attracted to each other. She bore a resemblance to Blanca de Sales, and he fit Natasha's profile of beau ideal as he was foreign, handsome, and physically well-built. Being the more reserved of the two, Natasha gave a brief impression she was not easily wooed, and co-workers on the set of Camille remembered her initial annoyance at Rudy's flirtations. They also recalled that when Natasha did return his affections, it was obvious to everyone they were a steamy item. On a few occasions, filming was delayed while everyone on the set waited for the two rumpled lovers to emerge from Rudy's dressing room. The fact that Rudy was still married to Jean Acker was a minor glitch on their Cloud 9. During the filming of Camille, Jean Acker's husband and Natasha Rambova fell madly in love. They dismissed the concerns of their naysaying friends by explaining they were merely friends working overtime to ensure Camille's success. But they fooled no one. Making their romance even more of a poorly guarded secret, Rudy did not hide the fact he found Natasha's Sunset Boulevard bungalow a far more entertaining place to sleep than his own apartment. Within the first few weeks of their affair, his clothes began a gradual sift into Natasha's closet, and every time he arrived at the door of her tiny home, he carried another armload of belongings. Natasha and Rudy made their first public appearance in December of 1920, when they arrived dressed in tango outfits to attend a costume ball at the Alexandria Hotel. Word of their brazen debut shot back to Jean Acker, and 1 month later, on January 18th, she filed a suit of separate maintenance against her husband, naming Natasha Rambova as co-respondent. Despite the fact that Jean Acker had never shown the slightest interest in being Rudy's wife, at least in the biblical sense, she launched an ambitious campaign to secure her title and his financial support. By the time her day in divorce court finally arrived, she hoped to have ample evidence that she deserved substantial alimony, Eager to tip the scales of justice in her favor, she hired a private detective to shadow her husband and ordered him to case out Natasha's Sunset Boulevard bungalow. In light of the consistent roles Rudy was securing in respectable movies at the time, it may be difficult to believe he would risk jail time by poaching for his dinner in the hills above Hollywood. Nevertheless, his wee-hour raids into the ravines were not the result of any excess imbibing of prohibition liquor. The truth was, he was out of work, flat broke and hungry for those quail dinners. The public had yet to view his first major screen performance in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, as the film's release was delayed until March of 1921. Metro Pictures made the decision in order to time the opening of the film with the convening of the Assembly of the League of Nations and the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This marketing strategy left Rudy's performance as Julio Desnoyers sitting in film cans all winter long, while he completed work in 3 more films for Metro: Uncharted Seas, Nazimova's Camille, and The Conquering Power. Nearing the end of production on The Conquering Power, Rudy approached Metro Pictures requesting they grant him a raise. He was earning a salary of $350 a week, and at the time both he and Natasha felt $450 would be fair compensation. Rudy's mentor at Metro Pictures, screenwriter June Mathis, assured him that his performance dominated The Four Horsemen, and on the eve of the film's debut she encouraged him to press Metro for the modest raise in pay. June Mathis reminded him how she and director Rex Ingram previewed the early footage of the film and found his work so impressive they rewrote the script to showcase his character. Metro Pictures invested nearly $1 million in the production of the anti-war film, and on the eve of the film's international release, studio executives were not about to reward its young and untested lead actor. Metro's response to Rudy's request for the raise and final offer was an extra $50 a week. Offended by their decision, Rudy informed his employers he would complete work on The Conquering Power under protest. He was hardly surprised when his Metro Pictures paycheck ceased, and he was informed there was no further work scheduled for him in any future Metro films. Meanwhile, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse premiered and was hailed as a cinematic masterpiece, with Rudy's performance as Julio receiving glowing praise. But while critics were raving over his performance, the rising star was again out of work and slipping deeper into debt. He and Natasha were living on a cash advance she received for work on another Alla Nazimova production, Salome. It was only through Rudy and Natasha's resourcefulness that they managed to keep the Sunset Boulevard bungalow larder full, and their 2 newly acquired Great Dane puppies fed. Friend and cameraman Paul Ivanhoe moved into the bungalow to share expenses, and Natasha pawned her jewelry and refurbished used furniture to make do. At low tide, the 3 friends drove to the Santa Monica Pier in Natasha's Buick Roadster to gather mussels for dinner, and Rudy and Natasha executed midnight poaching raids into the Hollywood Hills with military precision. Together with Paul Ivanhoe, they launched a small business venture by placing an offer in movie fan magazines. Anyone forwarding a quarter would receive a photograph of Rudolph Valentino as Julio Desnoyers. Even as the bags of letters with quarters enclosed arrived at the bungalow, Paul Ivanhoe secured little work as a cameraman, Rudy still had no work, and Natasha resorted to taking in design students. It was then, with all the common sense of 2 artists giddy with love, that Rudy and Natasha added yet another mouth to their household. When Universal Studios animal trainer Curly Stecker showed them a 6-week-old lion cub, they begged him to allow him to keep the cat as a pet. Curly explained it was impossible, if not dangerous, to domesticate a lion, but Natasha and Rudy agreed to the contrary. Curly knew better and told them so, but Zayla, the lion cub, soon joined the bungalow household. Not long after Zayla's arrival, Rudy announced to Natasha and roommate Paul Ivanhoe that he had just signed a 1-picture contract with famous players Lasky Company. He said the offer came about after he received a note from Famous Players Lasky executive Jesse Lasky and the studio's president Adolf Zucker. He explained that the note congratulated him for his fine work in Four Horsemen, and this prompted him to stop by Jesse Lasky's office to thank him for the kind wishes. It was during the ensuing one-hour meeting with Lasky that he signed a contract stipulating he would be cast in the lead role in one film. More importantly, Rudy told Natasha and Paul that he walked away from that meeting with a week's paycheck in his pocket as a signing bonus. Thrilled with the work and the fast cash, he said he hurried straight back to the bungalow to share the good news. Natasha and Paul were not as overjoyed as he had hoped. They both wondered how Rudy could have been so impulsive to sign rashly on the bottom line. Rudy paid no attention to their lukewarm reaction. After all, he was supporting a substantial debt and still owed his tailor in New York a great deal of money. He reminded them that there were many mouths to feed at the bungalow, even if they were several dogs, a lion cub, and a new addition to their zoo, a green moss monkey. He also informed Natasha and Paul that he was about to receive a paycheck of $500 a week to play the lead role in the film version of the popular novel, The Sheik. He added that if the film turned out to be a box office success, Jesse Lasky guaranteed him a longer, even more lucrative contract. The three friends celebrated Rudy's news by scrounging some bootleg wine and inviting June Mathis and her mother to crowd around a table in the bungalow's living room for a spaghetti dinner. Rudy was elated and eagerly anticipating his impending work in The Sheik. Within the next few weeks, he would be able to clear a few tabs around town and make many surprised tailors, barbers, automotive shop owners, and grocers very happy. In 1921, there was probably no more effective guarantee for an author's success than to have their work branded sadomasochistic, misogynistic pornography fit for censorship and banishment. E.M. Hall's graphic tale of a sheik's abduction and rape of a proper English lady met all of this criteria. Despite an organized campaign to condemn her work, when the controversial book first appeared in English bookstores, it became an instant bestseller and sparked a firestorm of popular obsession. It was not long after the book's release that the public learned the E.M. in E.M. Hall stood for Edith Maud. Edith Maud Winstanley was the author's full name. The revelation that the torrid action novel was written by a woman from the Derbyshire countryside stunned the book's mostly female readership and its ardent critics. Even Edith Winstanley's neighbors found this impossible to believe, for they knew her as the shy, retiring wife of a gentleman farmer who bred prize pigs. Now, this news piqued the interest of a young executive at the Famous Players Lasky Company's London office. 26-year-old Walter Wanger, the studio's general manager in charge of production, paid close attention to the Sheik's popular appeal. He knew the book was about to make its way across the Atlantic and was confident Mrs. Winstanley's novel would hit a vein of frenzied response in America. Wanger contacted Famous Players Lasky's vice president in charge of production, Jesse Lasky, to alert him to the book's arrival. Lasky relied heavily upon Wanger's critical analysis of all prospective stories the studio tagged for production, and listened attentively to his assessment of E.M. Hall's bestseller. In advance of the Sheik's arrival in the U.S., Wanger returned from the studio's London office and passed his copy of the sensational book onto Jesse Lasky's secretary, Jean Cohen. Wanger had little doubt Edith Hall's Sheik Ahmed would elicit the same reaction from Miss Cohen as he had from a legion of palpitating women in England. When Lasky's secretary finished her speed read, she was smitten, and Walter Wanger needed no further convincing. He handed the book on to one of Famous Players Lasky's readers for interpretation, in synopsis form, before Jesse Lasky and other studio executives. The first dramatic presentation of the Sheik, as rendered by Miss Julia Hearn, was so effectively executed that Lasky was immediately sold on the project. He summoned Walter Wanger to his office and uttered 3 words that would forever change Rudolph Valentino's life: "Buy the book." While other Hollywood studio executives were scratching their heads and assessing the feasibility of adapting the racy book into a motion picture, Walter Wanger wasted no time and closed the deal by purchasing the rights to Edith Hall's Sheik for $12,500. His prediction that the book would be successful in America proved to be on target, as the Sheik quickly achieved bestseller status. Due to Wanger's foresight, within 3 months from the time the book first reached its American audience, the film version was in full production on the desert sands near Yuma, Arizona. The star of the film wanted desperately for the Sheik to be a success, and thereby guarantee a more substantial contract for himself with famous players Lasky. When Edith Hall learned Rudolph Valentino would be playing her Sheik Ahmed, she sent him an inscribed copy of the book. Rudy kept her signed edition on his nightstand and studied the book as he labored over his latest role. He found the contradictions in the Sheik's character difficult to interpret, and struggled with Ahmed's disparate traits of savage tribesman and European-educated gentleman. By the first day of shooting, he was so riddled with anxiety that Adolphe Menjou, the actor portraying the Sheik's friend, Dr. Saint Hubert, made a point of befriending his jittery co-star. While Rudy worked diligently on his performance, women across America had no idea the screen version of the Sheik and the actor playing the lead role were about to hit them full force. As the Sheik was being filmed on the sands of Buttercup Valley in Arizona, life for most of these unsuspecting American women was nothing short of wretched. 1 year earlier, on August 26, 1920, they were finally granted the right to vote. Although this historic victory had yet to translate into any real women's liberation, it was still a man's world, and the majority of women spent their daily lives well restricted within the mental and physical confines of their homes as they toiled over laundry, cooking, cleaning, and caretaking. Most homes still lacked the simple conveniences that would eventually free women from such arduous domestic servitude. In 1921, many housewives hand-pumped water, cooked over hot coal stoves, and labored from dawn to dusk in the service of their family. It was profoundly disturbing to the controlling males of these households when many of these housewives began demonstrating a few sure signs of rebellion. But women's rising hemlines, bobbed hair, and makeup were not their only budding guerrilla activities. Copies of subversive literature such as E.M. Hall's The Sheik were discovered wedged under mattresses, and women's audible sighs were not going unnoticed as they caught a quick read between their rug-beating and floor-scrubbing. Men grew increasingly worried, and they were not about to allow the slightest crack in their status quo. Every effort was made to stifle the troubling trend. In 1921, a bill was pending in the state of Utah, which, if passed, would provide for a fine and imprisonment for any woman daring to wear her skirt higher than 3 inches above her ankle. And any women participating in local bathing beauty contests were hauled off to the pokey and charged with indecent exposure. But the effects of these and a range of other repressive campaigns were about to be undone by one lone rider. Just over the humdrum horizon of a nation of disempowered women, a nervous actor, cast in the role of Sheik Ahmed, was adjusting his desert robes and rehearsing his sprints across the Arizona sand dunes on his Arabian stallion. Rudolph Valentino was about to ride to the rescue. Rudy's paychecks from the Sheik were a godsend for the Sunset Boulevard household. Bills were stamped paid. Leftovers filled the icebox. And the Great Danes, the Moss Monkey, and the Lion Cub Zella were all fat and sassy. Even Natasha and Paul Ivanhoe threw themselves into the excitement of the production of the Sheik by appearing as extras, along with a little girl by the name of Loretta Young. In August, when Rudy returned from shooting the final retakes on the sand dunes in Oxnard, California, he arrived with a gopher snake and a new German shepherd he called Sheik. While filming was completed on the studio lot in Hollywood, Rudy was able to drive home every day for lunch. His motivation for these hurried lunch hours at the bungalow was an extensive restoration of a 1914 Cadillac. For months he complained to Natasha, saying her Buick Roadster had no pickup as it puttered around Los Angeles. When she finally gave the nod to use the Buick as a trade-in, he was off in search of a vehicle upgrade. Natasha hoped he would find something reasonable in exchange. But when he pulled up in front of the bungalow honking the horn of a 1914 Cadillac in desperate need of bodywork, she could only stare in amazement. Rudy's renovation of the vehicle bordered on obsession, as he installed a cigarette lighter, added new spot headlights, mirrors, applied a new coat of black paint, and meticulously hand-painted the custom trim. Every lunch hour during the final days of filming The Sheik, he headed home to eat as fast as possible in order to devote as much time as possible to the Cadillac. From a sly vantage point across the street, his wife Jean Acker's detective caught an eyeful during those backyard bungalow lunch hours. For a few days the detective watched Rudy as he sat draped in his Sheik costume while Natasha sketched his portrait. While she drew, Rudy ate sandwiches and tossed bits of bread to the several dogs, sitting before him, anticipating every morsel. To the detective's astonishment, a monkey, tied to a tree in the backyard, shrieked and pulled at its leash. And as soon as Rudy finished eating his lunch, he removed the desert robes, tossed them on a nearby table, threw on a pair of greasy coveralls, and headed straight for the Cadillac. His love was as hot as the desert sands. With this sizzling declaration, full-page advertisements in the Los Angeles Times assured moviegoers in the largest possible flowing letters that the Sheik would surpass all their expectations. On November 1st, 1921, the film premiered at Grauman's $1 Million Theater in Hollywood, and crowds strained against the barricades near Broadway and 3rd Street. Traffic snarled, and policemen waved their arms and shouted at several valiant attempts to break through the flimsy wooden restraints. A few arrests were made, but for the most part the crowd, anticipating the first glimpse of the Sheik, kept their enthusiasm in check. To accommodate the crush of moviegoers, Grauman's scheduled the Sheik to play continuously from 11 in the morning to 11 at night. They fixed their matinee ticket price at 35 cents. And all evening performance seats at an unheard of 55 cents. Grauman's management took full advantage of the movie's hype and booked no less than 8 prologue stage attractions with every performance, accompanied by the theater's full orchestra, the Wurlitzer organ, and a piano. Additional music numbers, including Liszt's Second Hungarian Rhapsody and a vocal offering by Mr. Darrell Cole, were added to the already lengthy program. During the last stage act, before the actual showing of the Sheik, a bevy of desert harem dancers billed as Grauman's far dance interpretations swarmed the stage with swirling gauze skirts and tinkling bells. Throughout the night's pageantry, the star of the show sat nervously in his box seat. He was utterly clueless that he was about to be broadsided by his own transcendent performance, and life as he knew it would never be the same. Rudy and Natasha were seldom early risers, and on one fall morning they were sleeping in once again. Daylight failed to cause the slightest stir in the bungalow, and they lay sprawled across their bed in a room vaguely resembling a mortuary chapel. The bedroom furniture was painted enamel jet black. A pitch-black carpet covered the floor, and the windows were shrouded in mauve taffeta. Rudy and Natasha rested in their peace in yards of black satin bedding, while curled at their feet, half hidden in the rumpled covers, lay Zela the lion cub. Even as the lion cub slept, she grew faster than her owners cared to acknowledge. Her tiny snarls, which they found so irresistible 3 months earlier, were becoming more threatening by the day. Denying the reality of the cat's inevitable metamorphosis into a deadly beast, Rudy and Natasha continued to allow her to sleep on their bed. It was Zela who first heard the whack against the outside of the bedroom wall that morning. She snarled to her feet, and before Rudy or Natasha could make a move, the cat pounced from the end of the bed up onto the sill of a small screened window. Her sudden weight against the screen caused it to topple out onto the yard, and to her owner's horror, Zela disappeared through the opening. Natasha grabbed a robe and ran out the front door, while a dazed Rudy with his hair on end followed a few steps behind. Half a block from the open window, they found Zela with her prey. She was tearing at the tattered pant leg of a suited man who was hopping towards a parked car. When Zela heard Natasha's voice, she turned long enough to release her catch. Rudy arrived just in time to sweep the heavy animal into his arms, while Natasha caught a long look at the man speeding away in his car. It was no mystery to her why this suit was hovering by their bedroom window. Gene Acker's detective had finally been successful and witnessed exactly what he was hired to uncover. Rudy and Natasha without cover. With her day in divorce court fast approaching, Gene Acker was gathering an arsenal of evidence in a bid for financial support from the man she summarily rejected. But just as she and her lawyer were putting the finishing touches on her case, they were forced to recalculate all of her requests for monetary compensation. The Sheik was opening in theaters across the country, and any figures they had previously tallied had to be promptly inflated. If cautious mothers and fathers were anxious about the effects motion pictures were having on their children before the Sheik, after the movie premiered, they broke into a full sweat. Despite all their protests, teenagers filled each showing to capacity and gasped in the dark as Rudolph Valentino's Sheik Ahmed rode his horse at full speed across the desert, kidnapped a refined English lady, and raped her for a seemingly interminable time in some dusky tent. It may be hard to fathom today, but in 1921, Rudy's on-screen behavior as the Sheik was considered such revolutionary, hardcore lovemaking that he instigated a national sensation. His performance generated instant box office heat and caused women to faint in their theater seats, besotted teenagers to emulate his every move, and inspired parents as well as conservative organizations across the heartland to collectively wince. Flashing what quickly became his signature menacing glare, Rudy had swaggered onto the screen to crease a few new wrinkles in the neatly pressed puritanical ways of lovemaking. On a 20-foot-high screen, before an audience of predominantly women and impressionable teenagers, Rudy violated every rule of proper parlor courtship. Not satisfied to grant the damsel a tidy peck on the cheek, he pressed his mouth in the palm of her hand, along the inside of her arm, the side of her neck, and planted his hands anywhere he wished, in full view of the camera. Reaction to a few of the Sheik's more passionate kisses was so overwrought that theater owners resorted to hiring uniformed nurses to stand poised in the aisles with smelling salts, their eyes glued to the screen in anticipation of their cues. And if Rudy's behavior as the Sheik did not sufficiently outrage, the fact that he was Italian made obsessing on him even more illicit. The same year the Sheik premiered, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, restricting the number of Italian immigrants arriving in the U.S. each year. Anti-Italian sentiment was rampant in 1921 and contributed in great measure to the uproar over the Sheik's popularity. With wives, daughters, and girlfriends finding the film's Italian leading man so appealing, xenophobes sharpened their tongues and pencils in an all-out assault on Rudolph Valentino. Most of this hostile rhetoric fell on deaf ears, and the campaign to deter youth from the lure of the foreigner, known as Sheik Rudolph Valentino, by and large failed miserably. Undeterred, local newspapers published anti-Sheik editorials, and ministers grew red-faced as they pounded their pulpits, imploring their parishioners to avoid the temptation of the corner picture show's box office sensation, the Sheik. Children were duly warned that by failing to resist any temptation to emulate the Sheik, they would taint their family's respectable names forever. Rudy's audiences were intoxicated by his exhilarating new way of making love, and embraced his sensational performance as a titillating education in unheard-of displays of passion. In the eyes of his female fans, Rudy quickly assumed the stature of pioneer, champion, and five-star shaman of sexual liberation. They were adamant that when it came to romance and lovemaking, he outplayed anyone on screen and deserved the moniker the Great Lover. Beaux and husbands, on the other hand, with few references in their world for such displays of love, could only sigh in frustration. Their only recourse was to pay the price, sit through the Sheik, and watch the master at work. With so many people up in arms, wilting and wondering, the Sheik's box office revenues were fat. Rudy had scored one major hit. Jesse Lasky was more than pleased with Rudy's performance and offered him a second contract stipulating his appearance in one more movie with famous players Lasky. Rudy would be paid $700 a week to star in the lead role of a screen version of Frank Norris's seafaring adventure novel, Moran of the Lady Letty, scheduled to be filmed in San Francisco. Paul Ivanhoe was hired as a cameraman, and he and Rudy made the trip to San Francisco together a few days before shooting began. After their long day's filming on the docks of San Francisco, Rudy and Paul returned to their suite at the St. Francis Hotel, where they ate an early dinner, napped until midnight, and then hit the Barbary Coast to paint San Francisco a serious red. With Natasha's work on Nazimova's production of Salome intensifying, she opted to remain in Los Angeles. One morning as she sat with her coffee and a fresh copy of the Los Angeles Times, she happened to scan a daily gossip column. There in black and white was the detailed report. The star of the Sheik, Rudolph Valentino, and cameraman Paul Ivanhoe had been spotted in San Francisco the past several nights in the company of the beautiful actress Miss Eileen Pringle. Natasha steamed at the kick-in-the-teeth item, packed a suitcase, and boarded the next train up the California coast to San Francisco. With her mother Muzzy and stepfather Uncle Dickie traveling in Europe, she planned to stay in their San Francisco home on Nob Hill. Determined to get to the truth of the matter and find out whether her lover was having too much fun without her, she arrived in San Francisco later that evening. Across the city by the bay, just as the two drinking buddies were showered, shaved, and natty, their hotel room telephone rang. Paul Ivanhoe answered the call to hear Natasha's voice and listened for a few seconds before asking, "Where are you, darling?" Natasha shot back, "Don't call me darling." Paul scribbled down an address, mumbled an okay, and turned to Rudy. "Natasha wants you to come to this address at once." Rudy was puzzled as to why Natasha had suddenly surfaced in San Francisco, but nevertheless followed her directions to an impressive residence near the Fairmont Hotel. When a stone-faced butler opened the door and motioned him into the foyer, Rudy was not slightly bowled over. He paused to absorb what he thought must surely be a figment of his imagination. Gold-leafed Louis XV furniture, gold-inlaid floors, gold-framed artwork, and gliding down a winding staircase, a gold-gilt Natasha. Rudy stood transfixed as she made her grand entrance, wrapped tightly in a gold silk evening dress. In the rush of his enthusiastic embrace, all of Natasha's suspicions about Eileen Pringle vanished as quickly as the press of her silky gold gown. That night Natasha explained her palatial San Francisco home to Rudy by filling him in on key details about her and her family. He listened attentively and tried to reconcile the Natasha he knew with such opulence. For most of the previous year, they'd shared a cramped bungalow furnished with orange crates and second-hand furniture, which they painted themselves in the backyard on Sunday afternoons. At times they'd barely been able to scrounge their evening meals and keep their pets fed. He never imagined Natasha's family to be so wealthy and wondered why he never bothered to investigate. Natasha explained that her real name was Winifred Kimball Shaughnessy Hudnut, and that she was born to an Irish father and a Mormon mother. The Nob Hill mansion belonged to her mother's fourth husband, Richard Hudnut, who was her stepfather, Dickie. He was the founder of a cosmetics empire and creator of the popular Dubarry cosmetics line. Uncle Dickie had legally adopted her. Rudy listened to Natasha's revelations and slowly realized the bohemian artist he'd fallen in love with was, in fact, an heiress. Natasha's cathartic confession had an exhilarating effect upon her, and her euphoria inspired a spontaneous plan the following morning. She convinced Rudy he should act as her mannequin in a photo shoot with Hudnut family friend, photographer Helen McGregor. Spent from a night of heady revelation and lovemaking, Rudy was game for anything. Consequently, in Helen McGregor's studio on Post Street, he submitted readily to Natasha's whimsical design. His willingness to play along may have had more to do with the fact that his only role was to stand naked and allow Natasha to slather him with grease paint and Vaseline while he struck a few poses. That afternoon, Natasha dressed Rudy as the ballet dancer Nijinsky in prelude to the afternoon of a faun. She parted his hair, wound it into impish curls, and spread black and white grease paint over his body in large swaths. After a fig leaf and a few clusters of grapes were strategically secured, photographer Helen McGregor went to work. The grease paint photos of Rudolph Valentino were French postcard racy by 1921 standards, and Natasha was satisfied with her work of art. When she and Rudy returned to Hollywood, she passed a few copies along to their friends. Neither Natasha nor Rudy could foresee that Jean Acker would get her dainty hands on a few of the more revealing shots. With her divorce hearing close at hand, Jean passed them on to her attorney and felt confident she finally had Rudy by the fig leaf. On November 23rd, divorce court convened, and Jean's lawyer summoned a nervous Rudolph Valentino to the witness stand to testify, while a courtroom of reporters scribbled on their notepads and a crush of flappers packed the gallery. Jean's lawyer removed two of Helen McGregor's photographs from his briefcase and paraded around the courtroom, holding Valentino as the faun high enough for all to see. The satiric get-up worked well for Nijinsky, but did little for the young man then appearing coast to coast as the Sheik. The Sheik had only been in theaters for a few weeks, but in that short time the public had effectively melded the character of Sheik Ahmed with the young actor playing the role. The shock of the risque photos of the Sheik and a state of complete undress and debauchery reverberated throughout the courtroom. Rudy took a deep breath and explained to the court how the photos were nothing more than a study for a proposed movie role. Jean's attorney raised his voice to press his point further with dramatic accusations that this, Your Honor, was precisely what Mr. Valentino was up to with his mistress, while he was not supporting his lawfully wedded wife, Jean Acker. When Rudy's lawyer, W.I. Gilbert, rose to object, the judge dismissed the entire matter. The photos of the naked Sheik Ahmed, as he had submitted to his mistress for dress-up, were soon forgotten. For when Jean Acker took the stand to testify how her husband beat down Grace Darman's bathroom door and slugged her square in the face, the crowd gasped and tittered. The court then proceeded to hear further testimony from Rudy's friends and from Metro executive Maxwell Carger and his wife. Mrs. Carger took the stand to testify, saying it was only 6 hours after her wedding that a sobbing Jean Acker confided in her how her marriage to Rudy had been a terrible mistake. She said Jean was devastated and sorely regretted her actions. Testimony ended with Jean tearfully telling the court she was too ill to work because of the stress of the divorce. This prompted the judge to order an inquiry into Jean's actual physical condition and necessitated a postponement of the proceedings until December 16th. During the break in the court's proceedings, Box office returns from the Sheik proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Rudy had succeeded in creating a blockbuster for famous players Lasky. To his great relief, Jesse Lasky followed through on his promise by offering him a long-term, lucrative contract. Upon Lasky's advice, Rudy engaged the Robertson and Webb agency to negotiate a 3-year deal, which guaranteed him a salary of $1,250 a week during the first year of the contract, $2,000 a week the second year, and $3,000 a week for the third year. With his second film for famous players Lasky, Moran of the Lady Letty, set for immediate release, Rudy was scheduled to begin work on the first film under his newly inked contract, a screen interpretation of Eleanor Glynn's popular novel Beyond the Rocks, co-starring Hollywood legend Gloria Swanson. When divorce proceedings resumed on December 16th, Rudy testified Jean refused to grant their marriage any actual existence, and this statement was reinforced when Jean admitted under oath that the marriage was never consummated. Love letters from Rudy begging Jean, as his dear little wife, to allow him to furnish her with a home were submitted to the court. Jean sobbed throughout her testimony as she claimed she was still in poor health and desperately in need of her husband's financial assistance. When the judge called an end to the testimony, Rudy was confident his interminable wait for his divorce was nearly over. Unfortunately, the judge announced he would not render his decision until January 10th. Universal Studios animal trainer Curly Stecker was correct when he warned Natasha and Rudy that their lion cub would eventually grow into a wild animal. In the days preceding this painful realization, Rudy was the only person able to physically handle the cat. After he suffered several savage rakes, he and Natasha made the painful decision, loaded Zayla into the Cadillac, and headed off to her new home at animal trainer Felix Doc Graff's ranch in nearby Azusa. All of the animals on Doc Graff's ranch belonged to actress, writer, animal rights activist, and independent movie producer Nell Shipman. And all of the creatures in Graff's private zoo, both tame and wild, appeared with Nell Shipman in her wildlife adventure films. If Natasha and Rudy had not been able to consult with Doc Graff and Nell Shipman, their Sunset Boulevard bungalow zoo might not have fared nearly as well. They frequently drove to Azusa in the San Gabriel Valley to visit Doc Graff's compound. Rudy especially loved to perch atop the many habitats' wire mesh runways in order to watch the animals below, and was particularly fond of one East Indian honey bear. Zayla could scarcely have found a more suitable home than Doc Graff's Azusa estate. However, this provided little consolation to either Rudy or Natasha, and as Zayla was locked into her own enclosure, they both wept. They took solace in the fact that Rudy's paychecks had quickly created sufficient funds to make a sizable down payment on a home at 6770 Wedgwood Place in the Whitley Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. Recovery from Zayla's loss would be eased by the excitement of the purchase of this spacious new home overlooking Highland Avenue and Cahuenga. Until Rudy's divorce was declared final in January, he would keep a few personal possessions and a legal address at Paul Ivanhoe's new apartment, which was located a convenient 10-minute walking distance away. Rudy and Natasha moved into their Whitley Heights home the week before Christmas. Although their few belongings from the bungalow barely filled a single room, and the heat and electrical service had not yet been connected, they ignored the inconvenience and proceeded to deck the empty halls for the holidays. On Christmas Eve, a crackling fire warmed the living room, and they trimmed a towering tree with candles and red ribbons. Absorbed in their plans to renovate the new home, they discussed the construction of kennels, stables, and garden pathways, while hoping that on January 10th, the judge would grant Rudy his divorce, and they would be free to marry. Sometime around midnight, Rudy had a strange request for Natasha. "Wait upstairs until I return, and don't come downstairs until I call you." He seemed excited with his subterfuge, so Natasha played along. After 15 frosty minutes shivering in a cold bedroom, she finally heard him call out, "Babykins, come on down." Just as Natasha reached the light of the flickering Christmas tree and the welcome warmth of the fireplace, she heard a tiny yelp. There, in front of the tree, Rudy stood grinning with all the pride of a new parent. Peeping from the cuff of a Christmas stocking tacked precariously to the mantel was the furry face of a Pekingese puppy. It was love at first sight for Natasha, and she named her baby Peek Little Chucky. Natasha and Rudy spent the remainder of their first Christmas Eve in their new home as Little Chucky's rapt audience, and they both later remembered that night as being one of the happiest of their lives. They laughed, talked for hours, and nearly froze to death. As the fire burned into embers and bed covers seemed the only solution to the chill, Rudy removed an envelope which he'd tucked in the boughs of the Christmas tree and handed it to Natasha. While he awaited her reaction, she unfolded the single sheet of white paper and read a poem written for her which he titled, You. You are the history of love and its justification, the symbol of devotion, the blessedness of womanhood, the incentive of chivalry, the reality of ideals, the verity of joy, idolatry's defense, the proof of goodness, the power of gentleness, beauty's acknowledgement, vanity's excuse, the promise of truth, the melody of life, the caress of romance, the dream of desire, the sympathy of understanding, my heart's home, the proof of faith, sanctuary of my soul, my belief in heaven, eternity of all happiness, my prayers, you. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 5, titled Best Friend and Manager. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you can find your copy of AffairsValentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.